Benjamin and Abigail Monroe stepped onto the jet bridge as if they'd done it 100 times before, their first-class boarding passes tucked neatly in a leather wallet. In Benjamin's hand was a small box wrapped in gold paper, a birthday present for their grandmother. They were dressed just right for first class. Benjamin in his navy blazer, Abigail in a simple white blouse. They smiled at the gate agent who scanned their passes and said, "Enjoy your flight." They didn't know how fast that moment of calm would shatter. Inside the cabin, the soft glow of overhead lights fell on rows of leather seats. A few passengers sipped orange juice, others read the morning paper. Benjamin and Abigail found their seats in row 2, slipped their bags into the overhead bin, then settled in. Abigail tucked the gift box under the seat in front of her, her heart light with anticipation. Benjamin leaned toward the window and watched the tarmac bustle below them. That's when Heather Thompson appeared. She was tall, her uniform crisp, but her eyes were cold. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through half the cabin. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Benjamin straightened up. "We are in first class," he said, holding out his pass. Heather barely glanced at it. "First-class seats are reserved for first-class passengers," she said, as though checking a rule book in her head. She leaned closer, took the passes, then studied them with exaggerated care. When she handed them back without a word, Benjamin forced a steady smile. Abigail's fingers curled tightly around the gift box. After a few minutes of silence, during which the engines started their low rumble, Heather returned. She planted herself in front of them and folded her arms. "I need you to move to the back of the plane," she said, her tone flat and final. Benjamin sat up. "Why?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "Those seats are needed for other passengers," she answered, with no hint of explanation. She didn't say who those passengers were or why they mattered more. Abigail leaned toward Benjamin, voice trembling. "We didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. Benjamin looked straight ahead. "We're not moving unless the captain asks us to." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of his family name, even though Heather didn't know it yet. Heather's jaw clenched. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll call security." Her voice rose, drawing stares from every seat. Abigail braced herself, eyes glistening with tears, but she stayed silent. She pulled her phone from her purse and began typing fast, her knuckles white. Benjamin watched her, his face tight with patience. Heather stormed down the aisle toward the cockpit phone, her heels clicking like a judge's gavel. Passengers turned to watch, some whispering, others staring in stunned silence. Heather's cheeks were flushed as she picked up the handset. "Captain, I have 2 passengers refusing to move. I need ground security here, now." A pause, then a deep, calm voice filled the cabin. "This is Richard Monroe." Heather froze. The entire first-class cabin held its breath. "Would you like to repeat that?" Heather's hand trembled on the phone. The Monroe siblings are refusing to comply, sir." "I see," Richard's voice replied quietly. "Can you explain why you're singling them out?" Around Benjamin and Abigail, eyes shifted, some with confusion, others with a growing respect. Heather swallowed, her bravado gone. In that moment, the airport noise, the overhead bins clicking shut, even Abigail's silent tears felt far away. All that mattered was the name Benjamin and Abigail bore, and the power it carried. And suddenly, Heather realized the mistake she'd made. She lowered the handset, her face pale, as the full weight of her actions settled on her shoulders. Benjamin sat back in his seat, his arms relaxed this time. Abigail leaned against him, her breathing steadier. All around them, the cabin was charged with a new energy, quiet admiration for 2 young passengers who refused to be humiliated, and the unmistakable fear that comes when you find out exactly who you've wronged. Heather Thompson stood rigid against the galley storage compartment, her knuckles white as she gripped its edge. She could still hear Richard Monroe's calm voice echoing through the intercom, low and measured but laced with authority. That was the same voice she had watched in a sterile training video once, a distant face in a corporate orientation. Now it was real. It shook her to the core. She tried to steady her breathing, but each inhalation felt hot and ragged. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Benjamin Monroe and Abigail Monroe sat side by side. Their eyes met hers for a fleeting second, calm but unyielding. In that moment, she knew she was cornered, judged not just as a flight attendant, but as someone whose worst assumptions had just come back to haunt her. The hush in first class was suffocating. Every passenger was waiting for the next move. Some pretended to scroll through their phones, but leaned forward as if straining to catch the slightest whisper. Others looked directly at Heather with that mix of pity and satisfaction that only comes when you see someone powerful brought low. She had spent 12 years building her reputation, 12 years of logging flight hours, collecting commendations, earning promotions, and never once having to explain herself. And here, on a plane full of strangers, every step she'd climbed felt like it was collapsing beneath her. She pressed her back against the cool compartment door and tried to summon confidence. Instead, she felt the cold sweat bead on her neck. Her mind raced through the moment she had demanded Benjamin and Abigail move. At the time, she had convinced herself it was protocol. First-class seats were precious. But underneath that self-justification lay something darker. She had seen two well-dressed teenagers with a gift box wrapped in gleaming gold paper, and she had decided they didn't belong. Her snap judgment was as old as fear itself. Now that judgment had unfurled into her worst nightmare. Benjamin sat with his chest straight, shoulders squared, and eyes forward. His calm was deliberate, like a refusal carved in stone. Abigail leaned slightly toward him, her small hands still wrapped around the gold gift box. Tears had dried on her cheeks, but her jaw was set. They didn't shout or plead, they just waited, their silence twisted as she watched them. How dare they turn the tables on her? How dare they demand respect from someone who thought they were beneath her? Then the intercom buzzed again. Heather flinched as the cabin filled with Richard Monroe's voice one more time. "This is Richard Monroe. Until further notice, this flight is delayed. All ground operations have been contacted. The crew member responsible for the incident is to be immediately removed from active duty." A collective gasp rippled through first class. Some passengers raised their phones, pressing record with careful stealth. Heather felt her knees go weak. She didn't need to look around to see the disbelief and the pity in every pair of eyes. A young steward took the phone from her trembling hand and turned toward Heather. "The captain wants to see you," he said softly. There was no judgment in his voice, only sorrow. Heather walked down the aisle, each step interminable. She passed rows of passengers whose polite side glances collided with secret triumph. It felt like walking through a gauntlet of silent jurors. In the cockpit, Captain Lawrence sat with his arms crossed. His face was calm but stern. On the screen beside him, the airline's regional operations manager loomed, his expression icy. Heather perched on the fold-down seat, her uniform too tight against her shaking body. The manager wasted no time. He spoke with clipped precision. "Miss Thompson, you have been named in a report filed directly by Richard Monroe. He alleges you verbally harassed and attempted to forcibly relocate two first-class passengers, his niece and nephew, without cause." Heather tried to speak, but her voice stuck in her throat. "I didn't know who they were," came out in a tiny whisper. The man's gaze hardened. "That is the problem. Their tickets were valid. Your behavior was not." His words hit her like a fist. She closed her eyes, tasting the bitter tang of regret. The silence stretched before the verdict came. When it did, it was a cold blow. Effective immediately, you are suspended from active duty. You will be escorted to the administration office upon landing. If you choose not to comply, security will meet us before we even reach the gate. Captain Lawrence watched her carefully, as if waiting for her to argue. She didn't. She barely had the strength to move. Heather stumbled out of the cockpit, her shoulders slumped and her face drained of color. The cabin's hush felt heavier now, like the weight of every whisper and every recording. She made her way to the rear jump seat but did not sit. Instead, she stood with her back to the galley wall, eyes fixed on the floor. Every uniformed colleague who passed offered no comfort. They looked away, unwilling to meet the gaze of a woman falling from grace. Claire, a junior flight attendant freshly on board, approached her hesitantly and asked if she was okay. Heather stared at her, her lips parting but no sound coming out. Claire swallowed and took a small step closer. "I didn't expect it to go this far," she said quietly. Heather let out a bitter laugh that died in her throat. The trainee was right. It had only taken one phone call, one calm voice, one refusal to back down. As tears pricked Heather's eyes, she realized just how far she had fallen. For a moment, she flashed back to the trembling hands that had demanded Benjamin and Abigail move. She remembered the smug satisfaction she'd felt, imagining she was protecting first-class privileges. Now her own world had been upended in a single moment of prejudice. From the front of the plane, Captain Lawrence's voice drifted through the speakers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be holding on the runway a few more minutes. Thank you for your patience." The announcement was perfunctory, but had a different edge now. Passengers exchanged knowing looks. They understood that this delay was not mechanical or weather-related. It was personal. It was Heather's reckoning. Abigail rested her head on Benjamin's shoulder, her small form trembling as she fought to hold back fresh tears. Benjamin reached over and gently squeezed her hand. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned toward them and said, "I just want you to know I saw everything. You both handled it with so much grace." Benjamin nodded with quiet gratitude. Abigail managed a small smile. In that moment, Heather Thompson was more than a flight attendant in trouble. She was the embodiment of a single snap judgment's power to destroy. As the minutes crawled by, Heather pressed against the wall, her uniform feeling like chainmail that no longer protected her. She flicked her gaze toward Benjamin and Abigail one last time. They sat calm and poised, their dignity intact. The gift box glinted between Abigail's knees, a small symbol of love and family that had nothing to do with status or entitlement. It spoke of kindness and respect, qualities Heather had betrayed. When the plane finally taxied toward the gate, passengers sprang to life. Some quietly applauded as security personnel boarded. The sound was muted but unmistakable. It was not a celebration of cruelty. It was a celebration of justice. Heather straightened her shoulders as two officers approached. She lifted her chin, though her eyes brimmed with tears. She did not shout apologies or excuses. She knew none could undo what she had done. Benjamin stood and offered Abigail his arm. "Come on," he said softly. They gathered their belongings and rose together. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. As they passed Heather Thompson in the aisle, Abigail paused and looked her in the eye. No words were exchanged. Abigail's gaze was steady and forgiving. It was as if she understood Heather's humanity even now. Then the siblings stepped off the plane into a corridor of blinking cameras and hushed whispers. The door closed behind them and the cabin lights brightened. Heather was guided to the front door where she would face more than just corporate discipline. She would have to live with the memory of a moment when fear trumped compassion. As security led her away, passengers turned back to their seats or to one another, sharing relieved smiles and quiet nods. The tension dissolved into a low hum of conversation. Benjamin and Abigail emerged from the jet bridge into the bright terminal. Abigail clutched her grandmother's gift box tightly. Benjamin placed a comforting arm around her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Abigail nodded and blinked back tears. "We did it," she whispered. "We made them listen." He smiled down at her, pride shining in his eyes. In the end, the siblings had not raised their voices or created a scene. They simply held their ground and let the truth speak. Their quiet courage had unleashed Heather Thompson's fall, and for everyone who witnessed it, that silent victory felt like justice served in the purest form. a powerful reminder that respect is never given lightly, but must be earned through kindness and humility. Abigail Monroe rested her head on Benjamin's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to fly," she said, wiping away the last of her tears. "I was excited. I've never been in first class before." Benjamin shifted so her back was supported by the seat, his hand sliding across the armrest toward her. "I know," he said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." He sounded calm, but inside his chest, his heart pounded like a drum. The memory of Heather Thompson's cruel command, "Move to the back," still reverberated in his mind. They had done nothing but sit quietly clutching a small gold-wrapped gift box, yet they'd been treated like trespassers. Across the aisle, a woman in a tweed jacket with silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears leaned forward. Her kind eyes glistened with empathy. "I saw the whole thing," she said, voice gentle. "You two didn't deserve that, and she knew it even before your uncle spoke." Abigail offered her a grateful smile. "Thank you," she replied, voice trembling. The woman nodded. "I've flown with this airline for more than 20 years. That voice you heard over the intercom isn't just some rich executive. He's the reason this company exists. He built it from the ground up." Benjamin's chest tightened. He already knew his uncle Richard Monroe's power was enormous, but hearing it reinforced the scale of Heather's mistake. In the cramped galley at the rear of the cabin, Heather Thompson pressed her back against the wall, her eyes unfocused. 12 years with the airline, overnight red-eye flights through storms, managing medical emergencies at 30,000 feet, calming panicked passengers. None of it had prepared her for this. She'd earned every promotion through strict discipline, enforcing policies with an iron fist, but respect wasn't a rule in the manual. It was earned, and she'd squandered it in a single moment. The roar of the engines felt distant. All she could hear now was her own ragged breathing. Claire, the junior attendant, approached hesitantly, paper trembling in her hand. "Miss Thompson," she said softly, "this just came through from headquarters." Heather's heart lurched. She accepted the message with a quivering grip. As she scanned the first line, "Ms. Heather Thompson is to be removed from duty upon arrival and escorted directly to administration for termination review." Her lungs constricted. It was more than suspension. This was total removal. She felt the floor tilt beneath her as the words sank in. They didn't just want her off the flight. They wanted her gone from the company. The paper slipped from Heather's hand, fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. She had imagined a private conversation, perhaps a chance to explain herself. Instead, she'd been erased without a hearing. Claire cleared her throat. "They also request your badge and security key be turned in before we land." Heather stared up, disbelief washed over her. "Before we land?" Claire nodded. "They don't want you stepping off the plane in uniform." The humiliation settled like a stone in her stomach. Not even for gross negligence had she ever seen such swift, merciless action. With shaking fingers, Heather unclipped her badge. The polished brass letters, "Heather Thompson, Senior Cabin Supervisor," stared back at her, mocking her. She'd fought for that badge, worn it with pride, believed it granted her authority and safety. Now it was plastic and worthless. She handed it to Claire, who took it without a word. Heather sank into the jump seat, uniform still pristine but powerless, like a knight stripped of armor. At the front of the cabin, power had shifted. Benjamin and Abigail Monroe sat in their seats, calm as stone statues. The gift box lay between Abigail's knees, its gold paper catching the overhead lights. The hush in first class was thick, charged with a new electricity. Passengers had stopped their whispered conversations. Even the baby in row 5 was oddly quiet. Everyone sensed they were witnessing a reckoning. Benjamin leaned back, folding his arms. He stared at nothing, just beyond the seats ahead, as if the horizon lay inside his mind. Abigail rubbed her thumb along the ribbon of the gift box, her breathing steady. They didn't smile or flirt with the camera. They did nothing. Their silent resolve was their victory. It had been easy because their strength came not from aggression but from dignity and the knowledge that their uncle would not tolerate injustice against his family. Claire re-emerged from the galley, moving with a different air. She approached Benjamin and Abigail, offering them water and cookies with a tentative smile. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" she asked, voice polite but hushed. Abigail shook her head, her lips curving in a small, appreciative smile. Benjamin simply nodded. Claire gave them a respectful glance and stepped away, her posture softer than before. The crew knew exactly who deserved respect now. Heather sat in the back, watching Claire move through the aisle. She had once led this cabin with an iron will. Now she was a ghost at the party. Every face that passed spared her a glance of pity or scorn. She closed her eyes, the image of two teenagers, calm and unbroken, flashing behind her eyelids. How had she judged them so quickly? How had she convinced herself they were intruders, when in truth they'd been born to belong? Her mind drifted back to the boarding passes. She had scanned them twice. They were valid, perfectly valid. But that morning something in her prickled, a quiet alarm that whispered these kids weren't like the others. Two black teenagers in first class, neat and polite. Some part of her thought they were too polished, didn't match her idea of first-class passengers. It was not in any policy, not in her training. It was a prejudice she'd never questioned until now. "In the front," Benjamin whispered to Abigail. "Remember what Mama always says, nobody's worth more than anyone else." Abigail rested her head on his shoulder. "I know," she said, voice soft, "but it still hurts." He wrapped an arm around her. "We'll be okay," he promised. "We have each other, and we've got Uncle Richard's support. And we did the right thing." Abigail squeezed his hand. "Yeah," she whispered, "we did." Across the aisle, the older woman with the kind eyes patted Abigail's arm. "Your uncle did good," she said. "He saved the day." Abigail nodded, her eyes bright. The gratitude radiated from her like sunlight. All around them people shared glances, silent acknowledgments of solidarity. The hush was no longer oppressive. It was a sign of communal understanding, a promise that injustice would not stand unchallenged. Heather listened to the hum of conversation slowly rising behind her, tinged with reflection rather than small talk. She realized the plane was more than a vessel. It was a microcosm of a world grappling with fairness and respect. And she had tipped the scales toward cruelty. She closed her eyes, imagining the scenes she had orchestrated. The firmness of her voice telling two kids they didn't belong, their stunned compliance as she waved them away, the memory burned inside her. From the intercom, Captain Lawrence's voice returned. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff. We've been cleared to proceed. Thank you, passengers, for your patience." It was the routine announcement it had always been, but not anymore. The way he said it, measured and low, carried an unspoken warning. Heather did not respond. She sat motionless, no longer a member of the crew, no longer part of the machine she had once commanded. Claire passed Heather on her way to secure the front galley. She paused, offering a sympathetic look, then continued on without a word. It was a kindness that cut deeper than any reprimand. In one silent gesture, Claire acknowledged Heather's loss and Heather's humanity, but it was too late for mercy. The plane began to taxi, its engines rumbling against the runway. The vibration under the seat felt foreign to Heather. She was no longer in control. She was just another passenger, punished, humiliated, alone. As the aircraft turned toward the runway, the cabin lights dimmed. The overhead bins clicked shut. The final boarding call had long since passed. Benjamin and Abigail sat upright, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The seatbelt sign glowed above their heads, a bright reminder of the journey's continuation. Abigail clutched the gift box tight as though it tethered her to normalcy. Benjamin folded his hands in his lap. This quiet tableau was their statement. Dignity triumphs over bullying, and respect outlives prejudice. Heather's thoughts spun as the wheels lifted off the ground. She listened to the soft hush of the cabin as everyone sank into their seats. No one chatted about weather or flight routes. Everyone carried the same unspoken understanding that they had witnessed a wrong righted. Abigail closed her eyes, leaning against Benjamin's arm. He reached out and patted her hand. They both knew the flight would land, the engines would shut down, and life would go on. But for one moment, up in the sky, justice had flown first class. As the plane climbed through layers of atmosphere, Heather stared at her empty jump seat. It felt like looking into an abyss. She had lost everything in that moment: her badge, her authority, her pride. But most of all, she had lost herself. At 30,000 feet, untethered from the rules she once enforced, she realized the simplest truth. Authority doesn't come from a shiny badge or a crisp uniform. It comes from treating people with fairness and compassion. And that was a lesson she had learned too late. Down below, the city lights blurred into a stream of gold as the aircraft soared toward night. Inside the cabin, the quiet settled like a soft blanket. Passengers closed their eyes, stirred occasionally by the gentle hum. Abigail drifted off to sleep, her curls brushing Benjamin's jacket. Benjamin stared out the small oval window at the dark horizon, the gold gift box in his lap, a symbol of a journey far greater than any destination. In the back, Heather Thompson remained seated, invisible and alone, grappling with the wreckage of her actions. And for everyone on that flight, it was a journey they would remember long after the landing gear touched down. A story of injustice confronted, of courage in silent defiance, and of the mighty brought low by their own cruelty. It was a reminder that respect is precious, that prejudice can unravel a career, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply standing firm in what is right. Claire moved quietly down the aisle and set 2 bottles of cold water on Abigail's tray table without waiting for a reply. "You look like you might need these," she said softly. Abigail reached for one, her fingers brushing Claire's hand as though in thanks. Claire offered a small nod and stepped back. In that gentle gesture, there was more kindness than anything Heather Thompson had shown all flight. Abigail unwrapped the cap and took a slow sip, resting the bottle against the ribbon on the gift box. "Are we still landing on time?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Claire paused, glancing first at Benjamin, then toward the front of the cabin. "Yes," she said quietly, "we will land on schedule. But when you step off the plane, you may see some people waiting at the gate." Benjamin turned his head, his brow knit. "What kind of people?" he asked. Claire took a breath. "Corporate visitors, from the very top. Your uncle is not just waiting, he is bringing people with him." Abigail's eyes widened beneath the cabin lights. "Why?" she said in a small voice. Claire swallowed. "Because he is treating this not like an error by cabin crew, but like a public statement. He wants everyone, inside and outside the company, to see the consequences." The implication hung heavy between them. Claire's voice held a tremor when she said that, and then she moved away, her expression unreadable. In the rear galley, Heather Thompson still sat, pressed against the wall, staring as though the white steel panel would offer her some escape. The jump seat felt harder today, the edges cutting into her legs like a reminder that she no longer belonged. Her uniform, once so crisp and authoritative, felt heavy with shame. Her name tag lay gone from her collar. She had surrendered it, but its absence pressed against her like a ghost. She closed her eyes, trying to replay the events in sequence. The boarding passes had been fine. She had scanned them twice. Still, she had decided they did not belong. 2 neatly dressed black teenagers in first class. Something inside her had burned with impatience that they had taken seats she had reserved for others. She had not questioned that feeling. She had acted on it. Now she felt that action like a wound that throbbed with every passing second. Would someone meet her at the door? Would she be forced off the plane in front of everyone? She pictured Richard Monroe standing at the gate, flanked by executives and security officers. She swallowed hard, her throat constricting. She had always told herself that passengers' opinions did not matter, that her job was to manage the cabin, not to make friends. Yet now, with her career dangling on a thread, she realized how much of her power had depended on fear, not respect. Fear did not protect you when the people above you stopped defending you. She thought of that as the plane dipped toward the runway, its descent smooth, but her own descent into disgrace felt like a nosedive. The captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent in about 10 minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare the cabin for arrival." Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Heather did not move. The word crew felt hollow now. She was no longer part of one. The seatbelt sign lit up above her head with a soft chime. She checked that her own belt was fastened, though she knew she would not be going anywhere until they allowed her to step off. Around her, the cabin filled with the usual preparations. Passengers clicked their belts into place, folded away trays, stowed headsets. But the usual buzz of conversation was gone. It had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension so thick you could almost taste it. Checklists were completed, overhead bins latched, lights dimmed. Heather's stomach twisted as she imagined someone calling her name. Heather Thompson, Senior Cabin Supervisor, Escort to Administration. It played in her mind like a dirge. She had always prided herself on flawless execution, on maintaining order. Yet here she sat, paralyzed, stripped of her badge, stripped of her dignity. At row 2, Benjamin and Abigail remained composed. Benjamin kept his arms folded, his gaze steady as though waiting for a performance. Abigail picked at the ribbon on the gift box, her lips pressed together. They had been through storms before, storms of whispered suspicion, unfair glances. But this was the first storm that had threatened not just their comfort, but their innocence. They had not cried out, they had not raised their voices, they had simply waited, letting the storm pass through. Across the aisle, the silver-hailed woman brushed away a loose strand of hair and leaned forward again. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked Abigail in a voice gentle as cotton. Abigail nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I am just ready to be off this plane." The woman smiled sympathetically and settled back in her seat. She had witnessed the entire ordeal, and many others had too. Some had recorded it on phones, others had watched in silence, knowing that no bystander intervention had come when it was needed. In the cockpit, Captain Lawrence monitored the instruments and watched runway lights approach. He had flown through thunderheads that could have torn the skin off the fuselage. He had handled unresponsive passengers and navigated avalanches of mechanical issues. Yet, nothing felt as urgent as the scene unfolding in his cabin. He did not need Richard Monroe's orders to know that this incident would be discussed in boardrooms. He felt its weight in every control click. Claire stood in the front galley, hands clasped behind her back, waiting for the final approach. She looked at Heather as if that would offer comfort, but Heather did not meet her eyes. Claire understood. It was not her place to offer explanations. The plane would land, and Heather would walk down the aisle into a squad of corporate personnel. The cabin lights brightened as the wheels touched the runway with a soft thud at exactly 15,000 feet per minute descent. The engines whined against the ground, decelerating, and the cabin filled with the faint vibration of rubber on tarmac. Passengers exhaled. The usual murmur of relief was joined by quiet speculation. Will she really be fired? Will he actually be waiting? Some leaned forward, trying to glimpse through the front cabin door. Heather sat stiffly, as though immobilized by shame. She dared not look up. Movement felt like a betrayal. She did not want to see the lines of suited figures in the jet bridge or the stern face of Richard Monroe, but she knew she could not help herself. She raised her head slowly, barely a centimeter, and peered toward the front of the plane. There, framed by the doorway, stood Richard Monroe in a charcoal gray suit that was cut to measure. He was flanked by 2 security officers in dark uniforms and a woman holding a clipboard. Her features were hard but impassive. They looked like a somber honor guard assembling for an official ceremony. They looked like judgment incarnate. Passengers watched the tableau. Some rose to collect belongings, but their eyes never left the scene. A hush fell as corporate representatives stepped onto the plane, their shoes clicking softly on the carpet. The first officer opened the door wider, and a soft flood of fluorescent terminal light spilled into the cabin. Heather Thompson rose on trembling legs. Her uniform felt like lead. Her cheeks burned with the memory of every harsh word she had spoken. She straightened her back, though her shoulders threatened to buckle. She took one step, then another, her eyes cast downward. Benjamin and Abigail watched her approach as the cabin filled with a silence that seemed impossible. Every bubble wrap of a headphone adjustment echoed like a shout. The ambient in-flight music in the background felt like a cruel soundtrack. Claire hovered near the front, ready to hand over the plane once authority transferred. Passengers set aside magazines and newspapers, craning their necks. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the sense that they were about to witness a reckoning. Near the doorway, Heather stood before Richard Monroe. The corporate team formed a semicircle, giving space for the confrontation. Richard's face was calm and controlled. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger or pity. He simply looked at Heather with a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. Heather's mouth opened, but no words came. Her voice had deserted her. She thought perhaps an apology would save her, but she realized this was not about this one flight. It was about a message that needed to be sent. Prejudice has consequences, no matter how well hidden. Richard Monroe spoke softly but firmly. "Heather Thompson, you have been removed from duty effective immediately. You will report to our administration office upon arrival. You are no longer authorized to wear this uniform or represent our company." His words were as precise as a scalpel. They cut through every defense she might have had. Heather nodded, unable to speak. She felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to apologize, to beg for mercy, to explain that she had acted in fear and not malice. But the tremor in her voice made that impossible. She simply lowered her head and stepped aside. Benjamin rose then, his body tall and composed. Abigail stood with him, clutching the gift box to her chest. They walked past Heather with measured steps. Benjamin paused as he reached her side and offered a small nod. Abigail gave Heather a quiet look, one that spoke of empathy rather than triumph. "It said you did wrong, but I believe you can learn better." Heather watched them go, tears slipping down her cheeks. There was no anger in their faces. There was only quiet dignity. The sight pierced her heart. She realized she had not just lost her job. She had lost the respect she thought she commanded. She had lost the compassion she could have shown but denied. The plane emptied row by row. Passengers filed past Heather, some whispering condolences, others offering sympathetic glances. A few held out their hands in silent support. Claire remained near Heather's side once the siblings had left. She placed a gentle hand on Heather's arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Heather did not respond. Words felt too small now. At the bottom of the aisle, Benjamin and Abigail paused and turned. Abigail raised the gift box toward Claire. Claire accepted it with a surprised smile and tucked it under her arm. "Thank you," the girl said, so quietly that only Claire heard. Claire nodded, her eyes moist. As they stepped into the jet bridge, the corporate team fell into step behind them, escorting them toward the terminal. Richard Monroe walked just behind his niece and nephew, watching over them like a guardian. The group moved forward, leaving Heather and the rest of the crew standing in the cabin. Heather stood alone for a moment, the cabin emptier than it had ever been. She touched the seat back where she had sat and remembered the weight of her uniform, the voice of authority she had so easily wielded. Now, that authority was gone. She glanced at the cabin windows and watched the siblings pass under the bright terminal lights, their figures small against the glass wall. The distant murmur of rolling luggage and airport announcements filtered back to her. It sounded like a distant life. Claire guided Heather to the cockpit door. Captain Lawrence stood there, his expression unreadable. He looked at Heather once, then offered her a single word, "Goodbye." Heather nodded and walked through the doorway, her footsteps quiet. The cockpit door clicked shut behind her. In the empty cabin, the crew began the final checks to prepare for the next boarding. They moved with purpose, but weighed down by the knowledge that this flight would be remembered for what had happened here, not for smooth takeoff or timely arrival, but for a moment when two teenagers held firm against injustice, and when power was wielded too cruelly. Outside the plane in the terminal, Benjamin and Abigail emerged into a corridor bright with fluorescent lights. Abigail squeezed Benjamin's hand. "It felt good to be off that plane," she said, her voice tinged with relief. Benjamin gave her a small smile. "We made them listen," he said softly, "and they did." He paused and looked back over his shoulder at the plane, now silent on the tarmac. Claire appeared at the jet bridge exit, the small gift box in her hand. She gave a small wave and mouthed goodbye to Abigail. Abigail waved back. Then the siblings stepped down the final few feet into the arms of loved ones waiting beyond the glass doors. In that moment, the story reached its climax not with a shout, but with a gentle closing of a door. The injustice that had hung in the air was replaced by a wave of solidarity and respect. For Heather Thompson, there would be paperwork and meetings and a reckoning to face. For Benjamin and Abigail Monroe, there would be a new memory to carry. A story of courage, of quiet strength, and of the day first class truly belonged to those who showed respect and stood firm in their right. As the terminal doors closed behind them, the cabin remained still, the lights dimmed, and the hum of the engines faded to a quiet memory. The wings of the plane glinted under the hangar lights, a silent witness to everything that had unfolded inside. And somewhere deep within that metal hull, an echo of a lesson resonated. True authority comes not from a badge or a voice raised in command, but from the power of integrity and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves respect. Heather Thompson pressed her back against the cold metal of the galley wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the entire cabin could hear it. Through the narrow aisle framed by half-emptied seats, she glimpsed Richard Monroe standing just beyond the door. He was impeccable in his charcoal gray suit, the crisp lines of his jacket resting on his broad shoulders with effortless authority. He didn't look angry, he simply watched with a steady calm that felt more terrifying than any shout. Behind him, two uniformed security officers stood at attention, their posture rigid, their eyes fixed on Heather, as though waiting for her to stumble. She could feel their measured breathing like a tide rolling in, ready to wash over her. In that moment, she realized she was utterly exposed. The faces of disembarking passengers drifted past her. Some stared. One man paused for just an instant and looked directly at Heather, his eyes apologetic. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. You are the reason our flight was delayed. You are the one who treated two polite teenagers like intruders. Heather swallowed, the bitterness rising in her throat. She had once believed that 12 years of flawless service, the commendations, the promotions, and the ironclad cabin protocols would shield her. Now, every badge she'd earned felt like a target aimed squarely at her chest. Up front, Benjamin Monroe sat with his back straight against the leather upholstery. His shoulders were relaxed, but his posture was unyielding, like a tree rooted deep in the earth. Abigail clutched the small gold-wrapped box in her lap, her fingers tracing the ribbon as though anchoring herself against the storm of humiliation Heather had begged upon them. Their uncle, Richard, stood poised at the front door, watching each of Heather's faltering steps as she prepared to make her exit. He had halted a whole flight with one silent call, and now she was making that exit in front of everyone, her punishment as deliberate and public as her initial injustice. Passengers drifted past Benjamin and Abigail, many offering nods of respect or murmured apologies. A woman in a business suit paused and whispered something to her companion, words too soft for Heather to catch, but kindness dripped from the tone. Another older man tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of solidarity that stung more than any insult. Heather watched from afar as those same faces had once averted their eyes when she barked for Benjamin and Abigail to move. Now they were the ones offering silent amends. She felt the weight of every glance, every whispered condolence, and she wanted to vanish into the overhead paneling. Claire's soft voice called from the front galley. Benjamin and Abigail looked up as she approached, her steps measured and her expression gentle. "You're free to step off now," she said in a whisper. "But Mr. Monroe asked that you wait until all crew members have disembarked. He would like to speak to both of you." Abigail's brow furrowed. "Is it about Heather Thompson?" Claire nodded, her eyes full of sympathy for both the siblings and for the woman who was about to face her reckoning. "About everything," Claire added softly. The siblings exchanged a glance and sank back into their seats, the air around them thick with anticipation. In the rear jump seat, Heather fumbled with the zipper of her small overnight bag, her fingers shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Claire returned and knelt beside her, gently guiding Heather's hands. "Here, let me help you," she said quietly. Heather's eyes brimmed with tears, tears of shame, of fear, of regret. "Are they really going to do it right there in front of everyone?" she whispered. Claire's throat tightened. "They already are," she replied. Heather's heart felt as though it had shriveled in her chest. Behind her, the cabin doors stood open, the light from the terminal flooding in. In the doorway stood Benjamin and Abigail, waiting under the watchful gaze of Richard Monroe. Claire lingered by the exit, her face a picture of compassion. Abigail stepped forward first, the gold gift box held like a shield in front of her. Benjamin followed, his posture unwavering. Passengers rose to their feet, creating a corridor of silence that guided the siblings toward their uncle. Richard offered no smile, yet his eyes softened as they met theirs. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. Abigail nodded, her face composed, though her eyes glistened. "Yes, sir," she answered. He exhaled slowly, the faintest relief passing through him. "Good," he said. Then he motioned toward a waiting lounge off to the side. "Let's talk away from the crowd." With that, the siblings slipped into a frosted glass waiting area, flanked by two discreet staff members. Passengers watched them go, some straining to catch a glimpse, others whispering as they filed past toward the baggage claims. The cabin doors closed with a soft hiss, sealing Heather's departure and the siblings' private audience. Inside the lounge, leather chairs were arranged around a small coffee table. Richard stood for a moment before taking a seat behind Abigail and Benjamin's chairs. He watched them carefully, his hands folded on his lap. "You handled that scene better than most adults I know," he said. "You could have shouted, you could have yelled or caused a scene, but you didn't." Benjamin shrugged modestly. It wouldn't have helped. He met his uncle's gaze. Abigail leaned forward. "Aunt Heather's career is over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Richard's expression turned somber. "Yes, she has been terminated. Her record is flagged. I meant it when I said I wanted this to be a public statement. She lost her position because she chose who belonged in those seats and decided no one would challenge her. In public, in first class, where everyone saw." A flicker of regret passed through Abigail's eyes. "I don't want her to lose everything," she said quietly. Richard leaned back. "She didn't lose everything because of you. She lost everything because of her own choices, and because she refused to correct herself when she realized she was wrong." His gaze met Abigail's. "You didn't get her fired, she did that on her own." Benjamin looked thoughtful. "Do you think people will learn from this?" he asked. Richard paused, tapping a finger on the armrest. "Some will," he said. "Others won't. But the people who matter, those who remember this story, yes, they will learn." He stood and adjusted his cufflinks. "You two did more with your silence and composure than most could with 1,000 words. You gave me a chance to hold someone accountable without chaos. For that I'm grateful." A soft knock came at the door. A staff member peeked in and said, "Press is gathering near the terminal windows. Security is managing the crowd." Richard nodded. "We're done here," he said. He offered Abigail his arm, which she accepted. Benjamin followed, slipping arms linked with his sister's. They walked out of the lounge, stepping back into the fluorescent light of the terminal. Outside the cabin door, press cameras clicked and whirred, reporters craning to record the siblings as they emerged. Security officers parted, and corporate executives looked on with a proud seriousness. Benjamin and Abigail paused under the bright lights, the gift box still in Abigail's hands, and shared a brief look. Then together they walked toward their waiting car, their steps steady and assured. Heather Thompson's exit had been the flight's most dramatic moment, but the siblings' exit was the one everyone remembered. The grace with which they carried a small token of love through an atmosphere charged with tension, and as they disappeared into the crowd, the lights of the terminal reflected off the polished floors, a silent testament to the fact that dignity and respect remain the highest seats anyone can hold. Behind them, the cabin stood empty but for a few crew members completing final checks. Claire returned to her station, placing the gift box on a shelf where it served as a quiet symbol of the day's events. Captain Lawrence sat in the cockpit for a moment longer, staring out at the runway. Then he powered down systems and stepped into the cabin, his face unreadable but his posture conveying that the story unfolding on that flight would be spoken about for a long time to come. In the days that followed, news outlets replayed the audio of Richard Monroe's calm command, showing footage of the siblings' unwavering composure. The airline updated its policies, retrained staff on bias awareness, and made a public pledge to treat every passenger with fairness. Heather Thompson's name became synonymous with the warning that prejudice can destroy a career in an instant, and through it all, Benjamin and Abigail Monroe became symbols of quiet strength, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful act of revenge is simply standing firm in what is right and trusting in the power of dignity to make injustice take flight. Benjamin and Abigail followed the staff member through the frosted glass door and into the quiet lounge. Richard stood by the window, his reflection haloed by the airport lights. "A car will be waiting outside," he said, his voice steady. "A team member will walk you down, and I'll be contacting your parents tonight." Brandon rose and offered a polite smile. "We appreciate everything," he said, throat tight with the day's weight. For the first time, Richard's lips curved into a genuine, if small, smile. "No, Benjamin, I appreciate you," he replied. Then he added, "The airline will issue a public statement. Not a quiet memo, but a real announcement. People deserve to know what happens when those in charge abuse their position." Abigail gripped the gold-wrapped box tighter. "Will it mention our names?" she asked. "Only if you want it to," Richard answered gently, "but it will make clear who is wrong and why Heather is gone." The siblings nodded and stepped together into the corridor, leaving the conference room and the worst of the ordeal behind them. Outside the terminal doors, life throbbed on as usual. Cars pulled up, horns honked, and baggage wheels rattled across pavement. But for Benjamin and Abigail, the world felt strangely new. A black town car idled by the curb, its back door open in silent invitation. The escort gave a respectful nod and slipped away, leaving the siblings alone for the first time since boarding. Abigail released a slow breath, her fingers loosening on the gift box. She stared at the empty terminal forecourt. "Do you think this will follow us?" she asked, voice quiet. Benjamin sank into the leather seat beside her, glancing down at his hands. "They might say we ruined her life," he admitted softly, "but they'd be wrong." He met her gaze. "We didn't shout, we didn't threaten. You sent one text and I stayed in my seat. She destroyed her own career." Abigail gave a small, uncertain nod. "I never wanted it to go this far." "I know," he replied, "but it had to." The car merged into traffic, the city's skyline rising behind them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the terminal, Heather sat alone in a locked conference room. Her belongings lay in a plastic bag at her feet. Her uniform jacket was folded neatly on the table. The name tag that once gleamed on her chest was gone. Her company email had been shut down. Even before her shoes touched the terminal floor, she had been erased from every internal system. For someone who'd greeted first-class travelers for 13 years, managed cabins through storms and emergencies, this sudden invisibility felt like drowning. She stared at the blank wall, unable to find words that could explain how swiftly her life had spiraled from stability into ruin. A soft knock rattled the door. A staff member entered with a clipboard. "We need you to sign this," he said calmly. "It confirms your termination and the return of all company property." Heather stared down at the form, her eyes hollow. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," she murmured. The man offered no sympathy. He simply pointed to the signature line. Heather's hand shook as she reached for the pen. "I've trained people," she whispered. "I've worked overnight flights and medical calls, and now I'm erased for one incident." The staff member raised an eyebrow. "It wasn't one incident," he said flatly. "It was the way you acted, the way you spoke to them, the fact that you didn't stop when you realized you were wrong, and the fact that you only cared once someone powerful intervened." He slid the clipboard across the table. "You didn't get erased. You exposed yourself." Heather closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, and signed each letter with crushing weight. When she finished, the man rose and said quietly, "You'll be escorted through the employee exit. Someone will meet you at the back for pickup. I suggest you use it." Heather's head snapped up. "Why?" she whispered. "There's already a news crew outside the main terminal," he replied. "They're covering the flight where the airline owner's niece and nephew were shouted at and the plane was grounded." Heather felt her heart plunge. Her name wasn't in the headlines yet, but it would be. Flight attendant fired after mistreating executive's family. It would be a simplified story, her face pasted beside it, and she would be the cautionary tale, proof that prejudice destroys careers. Security guards appeared in silence and guided Heather through back corridors. She rose, clutching her bag like it could shield her from the eyes she knew were already watching. Outside, a black SUV idled in a private lot. She slid into the back seat and let the door click shut behind her. The driver eased away, the airport receding in her windshield. Her thoughts spun. "Maybe I can apply at a smaller airline," she thought. "Maybe nobody will recognize me. Maybe I can lie." But her mind raced back to the termination form, the flagged record, Richard Monroe's unyielding calm. This wasn't a private dismissal. It was a public signal to every company connected to that network. Do not hire her. Seniority offered no protection today. Back in the car, carrying the siblings, Benjamin leaned his head against the cool glass. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said after a long pause. "She had no idea who we were, and she still thought she could decide we didn't belong." Abigail turned to him, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "And now she knows we do," he continued softly. They didn't smile. They didn't celebrate. They let the weight of the day settle over them, older and wiser than when they'd boarded. Their phones buzzed, messages from family, classmates, and strangers. Someone had posted a blurry photo of their plane confrontation with the caption, "Flight attendant screams at two black teens in first class. Turns out they're the CEO's family." Abigail unlocked her phone and handed it to Benjamin. "It's everywhere already," she whispered. He scanned the messages, some questioning, some praising. One classmate writing, "Yo, I'm so proud of how you handled that. You made history today." He handed the phone back. "Don't reply yet," he said calmly. "Let Uncle Richard set the plan." Outside, Heather's car wove through the freeway, parking lots and signage blurring past. She stared at her reflection in the tinted window, her plastic bag at her side. Her career in aviation was over. No company would touch a risk labeled by that scandal. She didn't cry. She only watched the world pass by, a life unraveled by one moment of prejudice and a refusal to correct course. And in the heart of the city, two teenagers carried a small gift box that gleamed like a beacon. Their quiet courage had brought a flight attendant's reign of prejudice to a crashing halt. They hadn't had to shout. They hadn't had to fight. They had simply held their ground and changed everything. In that silent victory, they discovered that true power lies not in a badge or a raised voice, but in standing firm in one's dignity. Heather Thompson had always believed her years of service granted her immunity. 13 years climbing the ranks, 3 promotions, an unblemished record. She thought that made her untouchable. It gave her permission to judge quietly, correct loudly, and never question herself. But the silence she expected from Benjamin and Abigail proved to be her undoing. Instead of resistance, they offered calm, letting her own arrogance echo back at her. The moment she barked at 2 teenagers with valid tickets, she sealed her fate. It was their quiet dignity that shattered the illusion of her control, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because Benjamin and Abigail had not fought or screamed, they had simply waited. They sat with their heads held high, refusing to be moved unless the captain ordered it. That single act of restraint became the spark that ignited a reckoning no one saw coming. They didn't need a scene full of shouting or tears. They let their silence speak volumes. When Richard Monroe's voice came over the intercom, calm, unwavering, and lethal in its precision, it carried more weight than any policy Heather had enforced. Her authority crumbled in that moment. Within minutes, Heather's name vanished from the employee schedule. Her email address auto-replied with "This account no longer exists." Her badge no longer beeped green. She had been erased from the system, but not from memory. Passengers had recorded the confrontation on their phones, and the footage spread like wildfire. For once, the flying public rallied around the ones who had been told to move, rather than the woman who wielded her uniform like a weapon. Heather's fall was as swift as her rise had been certain. Meanwhile, in a private boardroom downtown, Richard Carter stood flanked by 2 senior executives and the communications director. A muted television displayed the breaking news. Airline suspends flight attendant after conflict with CEO's family. Below, a ticker read, "Plane grounded mid-boarding after discrimination incident." The comms director looked to Richard. "They're calling for a press conference," she said, concern flickering across her face. "Some want to know why we didn't handle this privately." Richard's jaw clenched. "Privacy is what enables this behavior," he replied. "This must be public." He folded his arms. "So what now?" the second executive asked. Richard's voice was firm. "We issue a real statement. No vague language, no 'we are aware' nonsense. We tell the public exactly why she was removed. This was not a policy violation. This was personal bias, and we do not protect that." Silence settled over the room, broken only when the communications director asked, "What about Benjamin and Abigail? Will they speak?" Richard shook his head. "They've said what they needed by staying calm. The rest is our responsibility." Back in the black town car, Benjamin and Abigail sat side by side. The city skyline blurred past tinted windows. Abigail finally spoke, her voice soft. "Why did she look at us like that? Like she already knew we didn't belong before we said a word?" Benjamin exhaled slowly, leaning his head against the seat. He reached across and squeezed her hand. "I don't know," he said, "but I think she's the one who didn't belong." The words hung in the air, and Abigail allowed herself a small, relieved nod. For the first time since boarding, her grip on the gold-wrapped gift box relaxed. Meanwhile, Heather sat alone in a quiet cafe near the airport. She had pulled the hood of her coat up and buried her eyes in a cup of untouched coffee. The plastic bag with her uniform lay beside her, as heavy as her guilt. She stared at her reflection in the dark liquid, tracing the memory of her own harsh words. A waiter hovered, uncertain. "Would you like anything else?" he asked gently. Heather shook her head. She didn't want to hear the voice of kindness. She knew reporters had already been asking about the incident. She could almost feel their questions slicing through her silence. In Richard Carter's office that evening, he poured himself a glass of water and surveyed the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. 2 legal advisors sat across from him, reviewing the draft of the public statement. Richard set his glass down with a soft click. "We're not apologizing for firing her," he said. "We're apologizing to every passenger who faces bias. We'll redact her name but not the action. Let people judge based on what they saw. He tapped a folder on his desk containing the passenger manifest and internal incident log. Without opening it, he slid it aside. Let the public see the truth. The next morning arrived under a soft gray sky, the streets still damp from an overnight drizzle. Benjamin and Abigail sat in the guest suite's floor-to-ceiling window alcove, watching traffic inch by on the wet pavement. They had barely slept, yet their eyes were bright with purpose. A knock came at the door and a staff member entered, carrying a sleek envelope. "From Mr. Carter?" she said kindly, placing it on the table. The siblings exchanged a look before Benjamin opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter on the airline's stationery, a final token of respect from a company remembering its values. Outside the terminal, the hustle and bustle resumed. Commuters hurried past with coffee cups in hand, unaware of the storm whose epicenter lay just beyond the glass doors. Cleaning crews prepared the next flight. Elsewhere, Heather's ride glided down the freeway, her contract canceled and her career in shreds. She stared out at the horizon, thinking maybe she could start over somewhere smaller. But she knew that would be impossible. Her face, her name, had become a symbol of the consequences of prejudice. A message posted online read, "Flight attendant fired after mistreating executive's family." That shorthand would follow her forever. Back in the city, social media feeds buzzed with the 6-second clip that had become legend. Heather loomed over two seated teenagers, her voice sharp and unforgiving, and Benjamin's calm reply, "We're not moving unless the captain says so." Activists, influencers, and everyday travelers shared the moment again and again, the hashtags multiplying like wildfire. Respect is not earned through a uniform. Power is not measured by how loud you speak, but by how you treat those with none. The siblings watched the coverage on a muted screen, their faces solemn but proud. As the day unfolded, it became clear this was more than a headline. It was a turning point. Airlines began reviewing their own policies, corporate boards discussed bias training, journalists wrote op-eds about the fragility of unchecked authority. For Heather Thompson, it was her darkest hour, but for Benjamin and Abigail Monroe, it was proof that silence and dignity could topple a legacy of prejudice. They stepped into their car, the letter from their uncle in hand, ready to face whatever came next. And somewhere beyond the city lights, a quiet victory soared on the wings of justice. Abigail unfolded the crisp stationery and read the final lines again. "You didn't raise your voices, but you spoke louder than anyone could have. You didn't ask for power, but you showed us what it looks like. What happened on that cabin was wrong, not just because of who you are, but because of what was taken for granted. Your right to be treated with dignity." Each word seemed to glow in the morning light, a direct rebuke to Heather Thompson's cruel insistence that Benjamin and Abigail did not belong simply because of their race. Benjamin watched his sister's face soften as she folded the letter and tucked it back into its envelope. Their uncle's handwriting was firm but warm. He'd closed with a line Abigail felt in her bones. "I want to thank you, not just as your uncle, but as someone who needed reminding that real change doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it starts with two people refusing to move." The memory of Heather's harsh glare and her snap judgment flashed through their minds, and they felt a quiet pride in the way their simple act had exposed her prejudice and shattered her illusion of control. They stepped out of the sleek, glass-walled lounge into the bright lobby, side by side, shoulders straight. A black town car waited like a promise rather than an escape. As they eased into the back seat, the moment felt different. This time they were not fleeing chaos. They were walking forward, away from the moment that had tried to strip them of their dignity and failed. Every detail of the airport seemed sharper. The hiss of automatic doors, the rumble of trolley wheels, the gleam of the polished floor. They had forced an entire industry to confront its bias. Outside, a massive digital billboard flickered with live news footage, still frames from the viral video, bold headlines scrolling by, and one clear quote from the airline's official statement: "We will not tolerate behavior that diminishes the worth of any individual. Respect is not optional, it is policy. No names, no faces, just the hard truth." Somewhere deep inside, Abigail felt a surge of satisfaction. The same silence that once made her feel powerless was now louder than any apology Heather could offer. Across cities and small towns alike, people tuned in. Some paused their morning routines, others scrolled without stopping, but many felt their hearts tighten at the injustice of two teenagers scolded for daring to sit in first class. Activists shared the clip as a rallying cry. Everyday travelers nodded in solidarity. For once, the flying public sided with the meek over the mighty, the polite over the prejudiced. In homes and offices, schools and buses, the story spread. A quiet lesson delivered in 6 seconds of filmed courage. Aboard one cabin, a stark reminder hung in the emptiness. 2 passengers had held firm, not with shouting, but with presence. Not with anger, but with calm. That restraint brought the plane to a halt, unseated a flight attendant whose disdain had been her weapon, and reminded every viewer that true authority springs from empathy, not entitlement. It was the most satisfying revenge, played out in real time against the backdrop of soft jet engine hum. Far below, Heather Thompson sat in a dim corner cafe, the remains of her uniform in a plastic bag at her side. She stared into her coffee, haunted by the echo of her own words. She had wielded her badge like a scepter, believing it offered invincibility. Instead, it exposed her cruelty. Now she was unseen, unemployed, and a public case study in the fragility of power unguided by But for Benjamin and Abigail Monroe, the journey was just beginning. They watched the city blur past, the gift box resting lightly between them. Their silence had shattered the status quo. Their quiet courage would be remembered not because they were loud, but because they refused to be moved. And justice, when it finally landed, did not need to make a scene. It simply arrived.